Hi, everyone. A warm welcome to our talk for the day. This is the fourth talk in the THF Talk series titled Negotiating Modernity in Colonial and Postcolonial Mizoram, The Life and Times of Sangin. This series has been conceptualized in conjunction with the ongoing fellowship at FICA called the Himalayan Fellowship for Creative Practitioners. As part of this, last year in October 2023, we had selected 10 creative practitioners from across the Himalayan region, from the Western Himalayas and the Northeastern states. A little about the talk today. The lecture by Professor Joy L.K. Pachuau will try and unravel the changes that occurred in Mizo society as a result of the arrival of colonial modernity in the Lushai Hills, now Mizoram, in the late 19th century. Um, Dr. Joy L.K. Pachuau is a professor of history at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. She has a doctorate in history from the same university, as well as a doctorate in social and cultural anthropology from the University of Oxford. At JNU, she teaches courses related to the history of Christianity in Asia in the 16th to 17th centuries and gender and society in medieval India. More recently, she has been working on the history of Northeast India with a focus on the history of identity formations. She is also interested in the visual history of the region. Her books, as some of you may know, include Being Mizo, Identity and Belonging in Northeast India, The Camera as Witness, A Social History of Mizoram, and Entangled Lives, which is the most recent one, Human, Animal, Plant Histories of the Eastern Himalayan Triangle, co-written with Willem van Schendel, published in 2022. Without further ado, may I welcome Professor Joy to begin the talk for the day. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ishwari, and thank you to the foundation for having given me this invitation. I just want to say at the outset that I haven't been very well, so please forgive me if you know there are some problems along the way. But hopefully there won't be any problems. So yeah. So let me try and share my screen. One sec. Okay, so as you all know, the title is Negotiating Modernity in Colonial and Post-Colonial Mizoram, the Life and Times of Sanghinga. Now, the reason I have chosen this topic is because many people were talking about identity issues when I had a talk with the foundation. And so I thought that this would be an interesting way to look at identity formation in Northeast India. Okay. Now, there are two or three aspects that I want to talk with regard to the title itself, which is negotiating modernity. And, colonial and post-colonial Mizoram is self-evident, so I don't think that needs explanation. But this idea of modernity is something that I want to spend a little time on, and then move on to talking about the life and times of Sanghinga. So we kind of use the word modern quite loosely at times, especially in day-to-day conversations. And modernity itself, when we were young, we used to, anybody who was wearing jeans, or so this was in the 70s or 70s, early 70s. Anybody who was wearing jeans was considered a mod person. Huh? So basically, it meant a very Western person or something of that sort. But we're not thinking of modernity in this regard here, but modernity is a sociological concept. It is a historical uh, uh, um, event, a historical process And it essentially um, uh, is something that differentiates what is traditional. Okay, so it is in opposition to what is considered traditional. So that is a very sort of basic understanding of what modernity is. But we also know that modernity implies a particular phase in the development of Europe, starting sometime from the 17th and 18th centuries. Uh, there was a modern form of polity, economy, and society that developed in Europe. So essentially, people like Max Weber have linked it to the Protestant Reformation that occurred. But I won't get into the history, the details of it, but only to say that modernity is linked with industrialization, and industrialization is linked with a particular kind of what was then known as, what we now call as scientific temper. Okay, so without a scientific temper, you cannot have industrialization. And so modernity is linked with rationalization, rational thought. It is linked with industrialization. It is linked with, and it brought about different kinds of impact on society. Okay, so when I say negotiating modernity here, I mean that colonialism brought brought with it a certain kind of ethos, a certain kind of governance, a certain kind of way of looking at life, and people from much more traditional societies had to make sense of it all. Okay, so that is basically the idea behind the title. And the other thing that I wanted, the other aspect that I wanted to talk about here is with regard to Sahinga. Now, why did I choose this person, this unpronounceable name, Sahinga? The reason is that Sahinga was born sometime in what was he born? 1899. He was born in 1899, and this is soon after the arrival of colonialism in the Lushai Hills. Okay, uh, so um, so the Lushai Hills was the colonial name of Mizoram, and so sorry. So he was born in 1899, soon after the establishment of colonial rule, and he died in 1990. So he lived almost the most part of a century. And if we consider the political timeline of Mizoram, his lifespan included, of course, the early days of the establishment of colonial rule, the creation of the Lushai Hills district under Assam in the post independence period, moving on to union territory status, and finally statehood. Okay, so if you see his timeline, his lifeline, you see that it begins at the time of the arrival of the British and ends up with the acquisition of statehood for Mizoram. Okay, so you can see that even politically there are a lot of changes that are happening, and Sahinga was one of those people who firsthand experienced those changes. Okay, so he also lived through the period of resistance against the Indian government, which began in 1966 and ended in 1986. So the period of the troubles, as it is called in Mizoram, the period of the Troubles was between 1966 and 86. So he lived during that period as well. So therefore, I have thought that it is appropriate to consider my title, "The Life and Times of Saigeen." All right. Okay. So now moving on to the next slide. Um, uh, can I ask for a favor, which is, can somebody come on screen, because I find it very difficult to talk if I don't see somebody on screen. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Shwari. Yeah, yeah. So a few have come on. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. So so coming to the next slide. Yeah. Um, So I just wanted to start off with looking at images which denote traditional Mizo attire. Okay, so very you may have seen all the bamboo dance. It's very common, and Mizos are often identified with this. For those of you who are a little bit more familiar with Northeast India, uh, at, at once you would recognize them to be Mizos and their traditional attire. Okay, so I just wanted to start off with that to suggest and to show the kind of changes that are happening through the course of the 100 years of of Sainina's life, and to see how the changes in attire was a means of self-expression and of identity. Okay, so this is basically to just sort of in anthropology, we often take the present as a standpoint, and then we move on backwards. So basically, this is to say that this is how Mizos represent themselves. This is how Mizos understand themselves, and this is how they are represented as well. Okay. I want to go back. This is for those of you who are familiar with the map of Northeast India. This is the Northeast India, but I just wanted to say that this particular region, the Lushai Hills, was yeah. So the British entered the region, and as early as 1826, and the 1820s, actually even earlier, but by 1826, there's a treaty that is signed with the Burmese, and it's called the famous Treaty of Yandabo. And so that is when the British start making inroads into Northeast India. And so slowly, they go into Nagaland, they go into Manipur, what we know as Meghalaya, also around the same time. And it is only by the 1890s that Mizoram gets colonized. Okay, and of course, colonization comes from sort of, the British Army moved in from three different directions. So that is basically the picture that I wanted to show. Now, of course, these are some images of the British Army moving up into the hills in an attempt to conquer Northeast India. And this is, I just thought these photographs would be interesting for people who often talk about colonialism in Northeast India, but we rarely get to see images of what the actual military expeditions look like. Okay? So, of course, there were cannons that were brought in, they had to be transported, and many people have written about the labor that was employed in the transport of all this and things like that, but that's not my sort of area. And this is also a fort. And one of the interesting things in colonialism was the employment of Gurkha soldiers. So if you look at these images, you realize that most of these fort settlements that were established was manned by Gurkha soldiers. This was another British fort that was established. And anyway, so I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of the terrain and the people in the 1890s. Okay, so this is an image that was provided by one of the early missionaries called Lorraine. And at that point of time, you had to negotiate a river to enter into Mizoram. Okay, so the Lorraine and Savage often mention the kind of jungles and forests that they had to, I mean, the fact that they had to go through jungles and forests using waterways to be able to enter Mizoram. So these are some of the early sort of images that we get of, about Mizoram. And of course, this is a later, slightly later image about bridges being built in the local areas. This is an early image of chiefs that of different chiefs, okay, from the Lushai Hills region. So you can see that colonialism was, has had entered the hills, and there is an attempt to um, one of the things that colonial modernity brings is an attempt to categorize people and to try and understand the effects of I mean the chief the polity that was existent at that point of time. Okay, so I will come back to that later. And here is an image of a traditional Mizo village. As you can see, usually on top of, it was often mentioned that villages were usually on top of the hills. Some say to protect against malaria, which was in the valley. Others say that it is also to be able to protect them from enemies. They could, see enemy approaching them from afar if they were on top of the hills. So this is a traditional Mizo, an image of a traditional Mizo village. Now, here is one of the early paintings of some of the tribes that were identified in the in the Lushai Hills. Okay, Lushai, Paite, and Poi. This painting was done by Woodthorpe. Woodthorpe was a colonial official, and he's done a lot of paintings for the Nagas also. So he came to Mizoram, and he some of the early images that we get about trying to identify the Mizos. Okay. Yeah, so this is another image of a Lushai woman and pipe, he calls it, again by R.G. Woodthorpe. This, he says, is the image of a Lushai chief. Okay, so I just want you all to take in, their attire, their costumes, and how they were depicted. Now, this is again an image of a Lushai couple, and yeah, so a woman with a pipe and a man with a long sort of pipe. The man has earrings, the woman has earrings. There's some kind of ornaments that men and women are wearing, and usually there's a shrug across over their shoulders. This is a slightly later image, I would imagine, sometime in the early 20th century. That was taken. Man is also wearing a ring, as you can see. Okay, so this is from the same sort of genre of images of people in the region at that point of time. Now, by the late 19th century, Shakespeare had taken some of the chiefs to Kolkata. And so this is the image of some chiefs who had been brought to Kolkata. And according to Shakespeare, they were not very impressed with what they saw in Kolkata. But you can see them holding their guns and sitting. Some of them definitely seem to be more powerful than the others because they were on the some were on the ground as well, and some seated on the chairs. This is again another example of a famous chief called Kamliana, a good friend of a political superintendent called Shakespeare. Okay, now one of the things that we have to remember is that there are slow sort of developments in attire that are taking place at this point of time. Okay, one of the things that strikes us in the case of the Lushai Hills, particularly, and also perhaps in other places as well, is that even in the early pictures, people are seen as fully clothed. Sometimes, the so-called tribals or primitives are often seen as not wearing clothes, or women are seen to be topless, for instance. But from and this could possibly be because in the case of the Lushai Hills, you do not have any anthropologists coming into the region, and these were basically, most of these photographs are from by colonial officials or by missionaries. And the need to to my mind, the need to exoticize them was not all that great. Okay, so therefore you find that most of the people that of the Lushai Hills are seen as people who are fully clothed, who usually have some kind of garment that is like, or a shrug that is thrown over their shoulders. Okay. Now, the second aspect that I just want to deal with is the kind of religion that was practiced in these areas. Basically, some people have. There is a lot of controversy, not debate, I would say, about whether religions in this area were animistic or whether they were a religion at all. Uh, so that debate uh, is something that does not have an end, I would say. But all that I would say is that um, traditional religions tend to uh, focus on uh, um, the immediate. Traditional religions tend to focus on the immediate. What I mean to say is that there is usually a fear of spirits that inhabit the world, the immediate world that they inhabit. Okay, there is usually, so basically the deities that are worshipped, or the deities that are, if not worship, propitiated, or the deities that are sought to be appeased, are deities that lurk around within the village vicinity. Okay, and that is an important point. Okay, which I will come back to later on. Uh, of course, there is an idea that there is a God who is far away. Very often, there is a God up there in the sky, and the Mizos also had that kind of an idea, that there was a God up there, but that God was not very interested in the day to day matters of human existence. So he was up there far away. He or she was up there far away. And in terms of religion, it was the immediate deities who had to be appeased and propitiated. Okay, so uh, so uh, so that is very significant, especially when Christianity comes into the region. Okay, this idea but I'll come back to that later on. Okay, so these are some images of some of the rituals being conducted at the time of death. You also have these Y poles here, which were it is a sacrificial pole, and then animal that is sacrificed, the skull of it is usually kept on top. So I won't get into all the sort of details of it, but as you can see, this is actually a Christian who's preaching, but he's preaching in the sort of village center, which has a lot of these sacrificial poles, and it also has a monolith here, as you can see, which was probably, established in order to, I mean, to usually it used to mention the animals that were killed by chiefs, or the life of a particular chief or a rich person and things like that. Okay. Now, of course, so basically, at the time of the arrival of the British into the Lushai Hills, uh, what are some of the kinds of political, social conditions that we see in this place, okay, in the Lushai Hills? First of all, um, the region had um, it was a motley of different tribal chieftaincies. Okay, this is something that we have to remember, and each one of them was trying to expand their territory, uh, or if not, expand their territory for jooming purposes. Okay, so you know that jooms require fresh lands every 5 6 years. You know the cycle. There is a cycle, and you have to move every few years in order and have fresh land, and then you have to sort of um, uh, uh, cut the hills and sort of burn the hills in order so that you can plant your crops. So there is a lot of movement that occurs. There is a lot of movement that occurs as a result. So you see what is the nature of the polity at that point of time? The nature of the polity was that you move from that there were chiefs fought with each other. Okay, chiefs fought with each other. There was uh, 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 the chiefs in the case of Mizoram in certain areas uh, tended to come from a particular kind of clan, okay, called the Silo clan. Not all Silos were chiefs, but many of them uh, uh, came to be from the Silo clans. But then the Silos were also warring with each other as well. So that, and of course, like if you had a silo chief and he had sons, so all of them would sort of could kind of gang up against some other silo chiefs as well. Okay, so the whole region, especially the what we know as the Lushai Hills, was a place which was in constant movement at one level, and the second thing is uh, that many of the chiefs were warring with each other as well. Okay. Now the other thing that my research in another area has brought to mind is also that during this time there was the introduction of firearms as well, and the British were able to prevent the smuggling of firearms into the northeast, but then the people from the northeast were still getting their firearms from the Myanmar side. So the introduction of new firearms um, meant that many of the tribes, especially what we know as the Chin areas and that northern sorry, northern Myanmar, were getting stronger, and they were able to extend their territory by the use of the firearms as well. Okay, so I just want you to imagine a region which was extremely sort of on the move because of the reasons that I have just mentioned. Okay, so that is in terms of the polity. We have already mentioned what it was in terms of religion, but we also have to realize that there was no sort of a great we know that traditional societies were very much based on kinship structures. So so that is very different from modern society. So kinship played a very important role in uh, in in building community networks. Okay, so in my book Being Mizo, I often say, I had mentioned in one of the early chapters that identity was made in movement. Okay, identity was made in movement. So, in a sense, in pre-colonial Mizoram, Lushai Hills, it was often said that the chiefs, people would not identify themselves according to a village. They would not say they are from such and such a village. They would say that they are from the village of a particular chief, the name of a chief. What does that mean? It means that the villages were on the move, so they were not stable entities, but that so they prefer to identify themselves with a particular chief rather than with a particular territory. Okay, so one of the points that I argue in My Being Mizo is that with the arrival of the British, identity gets territorialized. Okay, there is a identification with the territory specifically called the Lushai Hills, and then you belong to the Lushai Hills. Okay, you are a person who belongs to your identity is no longer made in movement, but your identity is made to a fixed territory. And I think this is what is happening in the Northeast a lot now, which is that there is a great um, association with territory. Okay, your identity is associated with territory, and it is particular to the Northeast. It may be particular to other places as well, but particularly to the Northeast, this territorialization of identity is something that comes in during the colonial period, and we continue to take that very seriously as well. Now, the arrival of the missionaries was another aspect that I talked about. This is a missionary lady in her office at that point of time, but that was not the idea. So this is an image of the early baptisms that were taking place under the under Savage and Lorraine. This is they were Savage and Lorraine were Baptist, so therefore there is adult immersion that is taking place. So there's an image of the missionaries come in the late 1890s again, and slowly Baptists and Presbyterians are involved. This is one of the early churches that were established, Sunday school. And so along with the missionaries, of course, came the need to the reading and writing. Reading and writing became a very, very important part of the missionary efforts. Now, reading and writing is something that is the result of the Reformation. Okay, the idea that every child should be educated, the idea that the idea of kindergarten. We talk about kindergarten today, and it was actually an idea that came out in what is known as the Second Reformation in the 17th and 18th century in Germany, where this idea that every young child should be taught to read and write and to be able to do basic arithmetic was a very, very powerful idea. So the first Reformation brought about, the need to translate the Bible from Latin to the other vernacular languages of Europe. And the Second Reformation brought out this importance of education so that, of course, people would have access to the Bible directly, but would also learn other things as well. Okay, so and all of that, like I said earlier, also led to the Industrial Revolution because people were more educated. So that's why the Industrial Revolution occurs in Northwest Europe rather than in Southern Europe. Okay, so it has to do with all of that. Anyway, that's not what my area. So this is one of the early schools and in those days, a teacher was sponsored by the village. He was given each household had to give him rice. That was his pay, and then the children they were taught by him on the basis of those kinds of. And then, of course, there were many books that emerged. It's quite interesting. So in 18 I think it was in 1894 that a script was made. And in 1903, there was a journal that was brought out called Mizoram. And there were many textbooks that emerged like this. This is Middle Reader, as the title suggests. So education was something that the Mizos took to very, very quickly. Okay, they took to very quickly. So there are many of this. This is an arithmetic, Lushai arithmetic. This is an English primer. Okay. Anyway, so those were some of the early developments that took place, and later on, the colonialism also brought with it, the need to form markets and things like that, which I guess I will not. So this is one of the early markets that were created, so that people would bring from their food from to the so the see another thing that modernization, industrialization brings about is this idea of the city. Okay, the idea of a city that is not dependent on the of not dependent on the villages or the agrarian regions around them. So, in fact, the agrarian regions tend to depend upon the urban areas. So, in the British were trying to bring about some kind of changes in the economy by setting up many of these hearts. Of course, there were hearts before also, but most of them were barter trade. So there's money economy, the establishment of these sort of you know these marketplaces, weekly markets, and things like that came to have a strong hold. So education, as I said, became a very important aspect, and then from very early on, we get to hear of many going down to Shillong and Kolkata to study, and you can see that there is a change in clothing, sartorial sort of changes that are happening during this particular period. Okay, this is a picture of a family. I thought it is important to kind of family albums, family photographs begin to take importance. And actually, these are very important, prominent Mizos of the period. But since it doesn't really sort of, it's not important for the rest. Anyway, so this is, you know, mm, I've forgotten. Sorry, I seem to have forgotten what image this is. But from the attire, you can see that there is a uniformity that is happening about what people choose to wear. And, there is a presentation of a person as being a modern man. Okay. Yeah, so this is, and then by the 1950s, when Nehru, as begins these Republic Day parades. These Republic Day parades has an interesting sort of background and story, which we take for granted. But it was conceived by Nehru as a means to show unity in diversity. He took the example of the Soviet, at that point of time, the Soviet marches that used to be held, and he felt that a similar kind of thing had to be done for India. And so he felt that people from different corners of the country should come and at Republic Day come and represent themselves. So this idea of university and diversity was was something that was stressed, but at the same time, what this presentation, what this was a formalization in my mind, a formalization of identity. Okay, it was a way the Mizos would represent who they are, but in the process, they were also creating who they were by the kind of clothing that they were putting on, by the kind of way they were trying to present, and also at one level, it is also an imbibing of tribalness. Okay, it is an imbibing of tribalness, because they were presented as tribals as well. So there is a celebration of tribalness, there is a celebration of identity, there is a formalization uh, of who you are as a result of these kinds of Republic Day parades that were happening at that point of time. So from this period onwards, you begin to see a formalization of Mizo attire. This is an image, I think it's from the 70s, where in the in Aizawl, there's a ground and people are celebrating what is known as Sabchar Koot. So there is a return back to old traditional festivals as well, in order to express who you are, something that was forgotten during the process of this missionary activities. But then there is a reassertion of all these traditional festivals that were taking place. Okay, so this is another of those kind of things. So so people are, you can see that women are beginning to represent themselves wearing these puans and the vakiria and amber beads and things like that. Of course, in the 50s, you begin to get many images of people taking on, the cowboy attire. Americans actually came to, and they brought their guitars to the Lushai Hills during the Second World War, and Mizos took to them quite well. And so in music, and then of course movies, westerns came to have a strong hold, and that was another way in which self-identification happens. Okay, during the this is especially during the 50s. So guitars come to play. Okay, so that is I don't know how much time I've taken actually. I thought I wouldn't be speaking very long, but okay, 49. So I'm going to talk briefly about Saihinga now. And so the idea just now was to talk about sort of the trajectory of the changes that were happening in colonial Mizoram from the time of the arrival of the British to, say, the 50s and the 60s, when Mizos were representing themselves and expressing their own agency in trying to express who they were. Okay, so what about Saihinga then? Okay. So Saihinga, he was born in South Lushai Hills a few years after the missionaries had reduced the language into the Roman script for the first time. And literacy, as we know, is not a mere reduction of a language to script, but also a mode of life. And hence, its implications were to reorganize life completely for those who could have access to it. Or for those who could access it as well as beyond. Okay? Other changes had also come in the area of worldview. So Saihinga, when he was born in 1899, his parents and grandparents had already become Christian. So in a way, he was a second generation Christian, and he himself was baptized in 1909. As I said, Baptists usually tend to have adult baptism, and as a family, they had to, bear the brunt of their conversion, and they were forced by the chief and elders of the village to leave their settlement and move to a village close to Longley, near which missionaries of the Baptist mission also resided. Okay, so sometimes we often think of conversion as being a very smooth affair, but it was not so. Huh? Many people had to suffer as a result of that, and many were kicked out of their villages, and they had to start life afresh as well. And so it was perhaps this proximity that enabled him to acquire the education that he came to have. So in Saihinga, according to, in my understanding, we see a man who was eager to participate in the modernity brought forth by the British, and his own sartorial self expressions are an interesting aspect to his life. One of the earliest pictures that we have of Saihinga is of him in France during the First World War. So he was a head clerk for one of the corps that went to France. I think there were about 4 corps from Mizoram that went, and he was the head clerk of one of the corps. And so we see him wearing a uniform as here. I think I'm not sure which one he is, but he's one of the guys here. And so he, as you may know, that many communities in the Northeast, including the Kukis, Nagas, Khasis, went to France during the First World War as labor corps, right? And so Sahinga brought out a memoir at the beginning of the Second World War. Um, when they heard stories about a Second World War breaking out, he thought it was good for him to jot down his memoir. And so it's called The Great War. Okay, and so in this book, this I mean memoir, he talks about how happy they were in receiving these clothes. And so this picture of him in France, this is him in France, sees him wearing in winter gear, winter uniform, clearly signifying the importance of being seen in clothing that was not common for the then Bushai Hills. Okay. So this is another picture of this is Sahinga here, and this is also another picture of him taken in France. And um, so, so he talks about how happy they were to receive their uniforms when they were on their way to France. This was in 1917. Okay. Now, from the 1940s to the 80s, we see Sanghinga in various kinds of attire. Okay, from formal Western clothing to those that seem to be a mix of the Western and the local. Okay. So I don't have many of his clothes, and I mean I don't have pictures of him in Western attire, but this is the attire that I found quite interesting. Okay, so it is an ensemble of a particular kind of puan. So this is a particular kind of puan known as the ngautikher, and white and black patterns, and but he wears it to the length of the knees rather than the ankles, as is the norm for women. And this was worn with a shirt and a coat and a tie. Okay, according to A.G. McCall, who was the superintendent at Isol in the 40s, it seemed very similar to the Scottish kilt that was worn in Scotland, obviously. Okay, so so when you see him, trying to, I mean, for me, I see him as being traditional as well as being modern, right? Traditional as well as modern in what he's trying to, in the way he's depicting himself. And his adoption of this attire seems to have been the result of his constant interaction with colonial modernity at various levels of the government and his deep sense of pride in his own background. At the cusp of Indian independence, he had risen to the rank of political assistant, and he was the first Mizo to have reached such a position in the colonial bureaucracy. And this was no mean achievement for the Mizos and him in particular, because he had only done 7 years of schooling, had risen from the ranks first as a clerk in 1915, and then going on to be head clerk, and then at Isol in the superintendent's office in 1932. So uh, he was a participant observer to transformations that came inadvertently, perhaps due to colonial presence. These included larger macro developments whereby it became possible for the people to identify themselves as Mizo, or in other words, as a nation in the modern sense. Okay, this meant that unlike earlier times where kinship networks as well as specific settlements defined who a person was, identification was now with a wider territory and the inhabitants of that territory. So you see that in the development of this kind of attire, there is a move from identifying yourself as being part of a chief's village, from that kind of identification to that of identification with a larger community. Okay, whether it was called Lushai then or Mizo now, this is the transformation that we see. Uh, Settlements prior to colonial occupation had not been monoethnic in the Mizo case, uh, um, but what Pax Britannica did was that it put an end to such fighting and provided for an overarching rule which facilitated and held notions of a Mizo nationhood. So, Sanginga's experiments, or rather his adaptations, clearly reveal his own engagement with his context as modern as well as traditional, as being part of the government but also outside of it, as one who could lend his own voice to the context in which he had been submerged. It was a means of showing the nationhood of the Mizos. More importantly, however, the development that needs to be noted was the possibility of juxtaposing the idea of a local with that of the Western and inscribing it onto attire. Uh, so, uh, what I'm trying to say here is that his story in attire is a response to the colonial encounter, and which meant a new way of doing things. And we can see that traditional society that was far simpler in organization and technology impacted lives in several profound ways, and the most profound, of course, being in that of self perception. Okay, so as I mentioned in an earlier, as I mentioned earlier, there was a journal called Mizo Levi, and in that there were lots of debates as to what it meant to be tsangkang. Okay, there's a word called tsangkang, which can be described as self improvement. Okay, as I don't know whether you have what do you call it, equivalent words, but um, I was reading a thesis of a Bodo student, and he said that in for the Bodos also this concept of unnati. I think the word unnati describes it well, if you understand Hindi or Bodo. So this idea to be Changkang was something that was ingrained in the hearts and minds of people. And so what colonialism was trying to do was that this modernity that we're talking about was linked with being being Tsangkang, or being um, I don't know what's the how to self improvement, okay, or being developed in that sense, and there were many ways in which they were trying to negotiate with those kinds of developments. So that is one aspect in terms of attire that I wanted to talk about. But if you read Mizole, if you read his memoir, it's very, very interesting, because um, here was a man who had just picked up education not too long ago, and he goes to France, and the one of the things about modernity is, as I said, rational thought. It's the science of observation. It's the science of precision. It's a sign. It's a means of logical deductions. So when you see his memoir, you see a man who was very, very aware of his surroundings. So, for instance, in his memoir, he writes, on such and such a day, at such and such a time, we boarded the train from Silchar to Kolkata, or on such and such a time, we boarded the ship, and then to be able to explain in great details the various names of the ships, where they stopped, and all of that were things that were very much a part of being a modern man. Okay, so also this is how he started his memoir. He says, "I am from that settlement called Thairiat, 5 miles southeast of Lunglei, a settlement of 30 houses and about 110 people. The settlement is about 4,578 feet above sea level. It is a healthy village, you know. So the way he starts off his memoir is, you can think of a man who was very very much conscious of his environments and the need to jot down these precise numbers, figures, locations. Okay, something that I think many of us fail to do. Okay, the other thing that I find very interesting in his work, and especially in this memoir, is when he talks about, they begin to see many, many new things when they go to France. And you find that you need to be able to communicate those things into Mizo for the Mizo population. So there is a new invention of words that take place, okay, and the new invention of vocabulary, especially for things like that, like cannons or submarines or fighter jets. All of that are, he's consciously making up words along the way as he writes these things. Okay, there's also, I found very interesting, which is something that I think most of us lack today, especially when we do our history, which is, I think, and I think I'll stop with that perhaps, which is the ability to laugh at them himself or themselves, Uh, um, so there is a particular incident. He says that when they were, since they were going to, uh, since they were setting out from Lunglei, um, so these were all just, band of folks who were village folks, who were people in the village who were doing jooming and all of that, and they were brought together, and a certain kind of discipline had to be inculcated in them so that they could make do their marches, so that they could be used in France. So marching or the march past was something that they had to be trained to do. So he says that a Gorkha Havildar taught them how to march, and we were asked uh, to march in 3 rows. And so he said, when he says right turn, you look towards a particular village. When you say left turn, you look towards another village. Okay, because people didn't understand what right turn was and left turn was when it was said in English. So he said, you look towards one village when I say right turn, and you look towards another village when I say left turn. So he said everything went off very well. But then when we went to another place and did the march, when he said right turn, the village that they were supposed to look at was completely different. Then the location had changed because they had moved to another place. So then there was so much of disorder and chaos, he said. And he said that the superintendent who was looking at us just laughed at the whole thing. So I find that, and he of course was talking about how such simpletons they were, and they did not sort of really understand the nuances of this kind of modern day sort of arming the living aspect. So I think that is a very important um, thing that is something that, I mean, I quite admire, because very often we take our backgrounds a bit too seriously sometimes. And The other thing that I found quite interesting in his memoir was that, after the end of his stint in France, he says um, that they were invited to work for another 6 months in France. That it was told to them that they would be given more salary. That on their way back from France, they would be able to go to London. They would be able to see London, and so they were tempted with all these kinds of allurements to stay for another 6 months. Their contract was for 1 year, So after that 1 year, they were asked to stay for another 6 months. And so then he says that, uh, uh, so this was a question posed to the whole, labor corps. And he says that one of them, most of them did not want to stay for another 6 months, even though they had a very good experience in France, and even though the war was ending and all of that. So one man's response, even when lying down, was not even simply, "We don't want it anymore." So what he says is that one person said, didn't just say, "We don't want it anymore." He said, "I'd rather see the dirty old chicken coop in the front porch of my house than see London." So I'd rather see the dirty old chicken coop in front of my house than see London. So at another level, I think what this reminds me is that even though there are allurements of living in the West, at the same time, many of them were very rooted to the cultures that they came from, and it wasn't as if this modernity had taken a hold of them completely, even though there were many things that was aspirational, you know. So I think I'll end with that. Huh? And I took longer than I expected. I'm sorry. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Joy, for the lovely presentation. I'm just wondering if we have anybody in the audience who has a question or any comments, thoughts. Feel free to turn on your video and also speak. Anyone?
Yeah, please. It'll be interesting. It'll be nice to know what others have in mind.
Nobody? No one at all? Lal, do you have a question? Thank you.
If no one's asking, can I ask Professor
Hello.
Joy?
Hello.
Um,
Hello.
Hello.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes. I think where
Yeah.
we will
no,
speak.
it's okay. I can ask afterwards.
Sure.
Am I still allowed to talk for a while? Actually, I'm trying to connect with my video.
Okay,
So I'm
okay.
having
Sure,
some.
sure. Please go
Yeah.
ahead.
So yeah, you may not be able to see me right now, but I'm still trying with the video. Yeah, I think it's on. So sorry I joined a bit late, and actually I was shared this about this Joy's talk. And this Pusahinga is actually, he happens to be my great grandfather. So I also just came from work. So I'm a bit late coming back from my work. So it's, first of all, I'm very, delighted to be here, and because it's about my great grandfather. And I'm right now in Guwahati. I'm not in Mizoram also, because I'm settled here. And so yeah, I could hear a little bit of what Joy said on Pusang Hinga, and I think so many things which I did not know before, many information also I got to know. And because when he passed away, he was in his 90s, I think, and we were still very small at that time. And so some few things I just want to share about him was that he was a very organized and a very neat fellow. And I remember that he used to have this collection of caps which he has got from the Britishers, and he was always in good terms, with the Britishers. I think maybe he did his job well, I think, during those times. And on top of that, he used to tell us many stories about, how organized they were. And also, I don't know whether it has already been said, but this one particular mustard leaf, which we call it Fren An in Aizol, in Mizoram actually. Supposedly, Pusahinga has got it all the way from France. It seems a seed. So that's why Fren is actually for France, and An is actually like a leaf, a mustard leaf. So from what we used to hear, it seems like he has got the seed of this particular mustard leaf from France during his stay there. And then later on, I guess the soil and the climate of Mizoram became quite fertile. So I think till now, it's available. It's very widely available, very common in the markets. So that is one thing. I don't know whether Joy knows about that. I'm sure she does. And I myself, even though I'm related to him, but there's so many things which I still have not, known about him. So I'm planning to maybe, discover some more. I think I'll also try to be in contact with Joy one day. Yeah, so that's a little bit which I just feel like sharing.
Yeah, thank you, Zikpui. And yeah, I'd like to be in touch with you too at some point. If you can
Yes.
send me your phone number or something later.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Joy.
Thank you, thank you.
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Hello, Professor Joy. My name is Verit. In discussing colonialization and in talking about decolonization, I feel that Nagaland is making great strides with names like Dolly Kilcon working on repatriation and restoration. So when it comes to the Mizoram context, do you feel that this conversation is just starting, or has it already started, but because the medium of communication is Mizo, that is, it has not reached a international or say a national platform? And what does decolonization for the Lusei people, what would it look like, and why is it important to start this conversation?
Mm.
And if I may add uh, one last thing is, if we were going to decolonize Changkang, what would that look like, or what would that entail?
Yeah, so I think, I don't know. I mean, I think, see, in the particular case of the Nagas and this whole thing about repatriation and things like that, personally, I'm not one who is very much in favor of it necessarily. Okay, I don't think repatriation does anything to an individual, okay, or to a society or to a nation. I don't think so. I mean, there are, if that's the case, if repatriation is, I mean, there's just so many things to, I mean, even within Europe itself, um, there are things that need to be repatriated all over the world. So I don't, in a certain sense, I personally am not in favor of blanket, this, I don't go wholesale for this idea of repatriation. Like, for instance, in many of the, medieval Mughal documents, they are in many of the libraries uh, in Europe, or they're, the manuscripts, for instance, they're in Europe, or they're in what do you call it, in the US. But many of the scholars would say that it's better when it's there. Okay, so I don't think I hope I'm not taking it too lightly, but I don't think it does anything uh, for anyone in particular. Like, for instance, like, yeah, if you bring the skulls back, for instance, from the Pit Rivers Museum of the Nagas, you know, how is that? Um, I don't know. I don't see it really sort of helping a nation by just repatriating them back. Okay, because there are so many skulls even within Nagaland itself, you know, that are there and they're just rotting, you know. So, in that sense, I mean, a student of mine rather, was doing field work and she went to many of these angs, and these angs have a lot of skulls, you know, and they're just lying there, you know. So, so I am not sure about um, how important in terms of uh, your identity and of your self perception and things like that. I'm not sure about the usefulness of it. Okay, that's one thing. But having said that, I will also say that there are many more artifacts in British museums and in Europe, you know, um, for the Nagas than there are for the Mizos. So even if you are planning to bring back, you know, for the Mizos, you hardly have any kind of artifacts that are there in these museums, even if you wanted to sort of bring them back. So that is another thing. Now, the other thing is, I don't, see, the thing is that we often see colonialism as something that is very negative, so this post-colonial kind of thing, I think understanding, okay, it has to be nuanced a little bit, I think, because I find that that's why it's important to study historical figures like Sahinga or any other. There are many people like him because in the way they interacted with colonialism, they were expressing. It is not as if um, they accepted it wholeheartedly. Like the way his attire, for instance, is an attire that is constantly negotiating between the traditional and the modern, you know. So it's not as if colonialism has completely sort of crushed your traditional identity. Okay, in many ways, people of that time found the scope to actively engage with their surroundings and also express their agency to the extent it is possible. It is only from hindsight that we can say, do this, do that. You know, it's only from hindsight that you can say many things. But if you think about it from the point of view of the person at that point of time, they are doing things and they're actually exercising a lot of agency, you know. So, in hindsight, a lot of the things that we do today, people may wonder why we do it. Why do we spend so much time on the phone, for instance? Or, there are many things that we can debate about and things like that. So I think this idea that colonialism came, it destroyed all cultures. Um, I mean, of course, I'm not saying that it didn't change many things. It changed many things, and it also brought. I mean, the question is, does one want to go back to the cultures we once were? You know, therefore, I think we have to sort of uh, be more historical and try and understand how people negotiated with these changes much more, you know, rather than thinking of it as something that completely changed and destroyed our own culture. But a very good question. I mean, a lot of uh, food for thought there. Like, what do you think it looks like? I think what it essentially, I think if you think about it, Decolonization, I think, is something that would is an expression of agency, I think, and yeah, negotiating with it and expressing agency. Can I ask where are you a student or?
Yes, I am. I'm currently doing a PhD from the University of Sydney. I'm working on decolonizing policing treatment of tribal people in India and comparatively with the First Nations people of Australia. So I'm working a lot with the decolonization literature, which is also very new to me. Yeah, thank you for the answer.
Yeah, you have to be, yeah. Maybe we can talk over it.
Sure, thank you.
At some point.
May I?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Professor Joy. That was, I think there's a lot of new learning for me. I'm curious to know, in fact, from Berit's question, I was wondering, you spoke about literacy, reading, writing. Uh, and I think I also see Joshua here. And in our last session, which we had, which was talking about archive stories, etc., there was a comment from Joshua and also my own curiosity. Firstly, what language was this memoir written in?
It was written in Mizo, yeah.
Okay. So I think what Berit referred to, which has also been my curiosity because I interact with the region a lot through the lens of literature. I've always been curious about like the language identity of Mizoram and what your thoughts are on that. And the other is this about the presence of written literature. I remember, my first trip to Aizawl, I think a couple of bookshops, and there seemed to have been a lot of books in Mizo, but very less that was translated. I don't know if I'm correct about that. I think I see a couple of names here among the participants, and some of them are writers whose writing I know of. But what are your thoughts on that? Like that, is this conversation, are conversations of from Mizoram happening a lot in Mizo, much more, and how do people who don't speak the language access it? And also this about like the role of language, the Mizo language in the collective sort of Mizo identity.
Yeah. Right, Mary. Yeah, very interesting and important question. So clearly, at the time of the arrival of the British, what we call Mizo today, or what was then known as the Lusei language, was the lingua franca. Like I think I mentioned in passing that Mizo villages were never mono-ethnic villages. Okay, so there were, besides Lusei people, and there were Mars, there could be Paites, but then it was the most prominent lingua franca through many of the silo rule territories, which is largely territories from Lunglei district onwards up north. Okay, there were others areas even here which was not ruled by silos, but there were Lusei chiefs as well. So anyway, basically what I'm trying to say is that it was a lingua franca, and but in a village, people could be speaking Mar and Paite too. This is not it's not to say that. And then of course in southern Mizoram, you have Mara and you have Lai languages that were spoken at that point of time, and in the what we call like the peripheries of what present day Mizoram, till today there will be people who speak Mar and Paite and other languages as well who still speak. I mean, not recent migrants from Churachandpur, but who have traditionally been part of Mizoram and who who speak these languages, okay, in some villages, in some areas. So, but of course, the fact that the missionaries came and they sort of standardized the Lushai language, saw to it that it became the lingua franca of the whole district or the whole state, and the formalization, you know, aids in translation of the Bible into the Mizo language. All of that aided the proliferation of the language, and it became to be spoken much more than it would have been spoken. And of course, certain languages also disappeared, like the Ralte language has more or less disappeared. A few people apparently continue to speak that, but I've never heard of anybody, who speaks the Ralte language. So that is one. And the second thing, of course, is yes. I mean, I think Mizos generally um, are, I don't know whether the Mizos here will agree with me, but we tend to be a very inward looking community, and our audience is ourselves. So, in a sense that, like for instance, I think Arkotong Longkomer has argued in some places like the Hornbill Festival is an attempt by the Nagas to exoticize themselves for a Western audience, non Naga. So Mizos are not, I think personally, not like that, and the audience is themselves, and they're happy, and so therefore, you're right in saying that there is a lot of literature in the Mizo language itself as a result of that. How good they are is a different thing altogether, but definitely a large number or large. I mean, there are mainly, I think personally, as far as I know, works of history and history in the sense of mytho-historical, I suppose, and works of related to Christianity, translations of English works into Mizo. A lot of that happens as well. I'm not sure, like the extent of, I mean, fiction in Mizo, or like novels in Mizo. There are short stories in Mizo, but a whole novel, a whole sort of book is, I think, hard to come by. Maybe somebody can correct me on that front, in recent times at least. So I think that is sort of the status of the Mizo writing in Mizo, that I can talk about. But it has definitely created a sense of oneness, so much so that people speaking in languages that are not um, that are close to the Mizo, but not quite, so it doesn't sound, it doesn't, how should I put it? I have to be careful with my language, with my words here. People who speak languages that are close to Mizo language and can be considered aliens. So I mean, there is so much of sort of insistence in the language being spoken in the right sort of manner and way. Okay, so diction, everything. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I'm wondering if I could draw Joshua in here as well whenever you're ready, Joshua. But I have another question. There's like in the images that you showed us through a certain timeline. And then there was also like a lot of you drew our attention to the ways in which people dressed. And then I thought it was also very interesting when you spoke about who took those photographs, that they were not necessarily anthropologists, but they were perhaps colonizers and the colonists and the missionaries, and how that gaze perhaps was not sort of exoticized. But I'm also wondering if, because in front of a camera, then as in now, there is a certain kind of, I don't know if I'm right, I'm just sort of asking you here, of the people who are being photographed also staging something, and what your thoughts are on that, and if in this trajectory in terms of how people dressed and up till the point where there was a certain kind of like the changes you saw, how the shirt came in, and then that last image you left us with, in how you see Mizo identity in its current day. Is it something that you would also say that in all of these influences, the rural and the urban Mizo share a commonality, or are the differences there? Has the exposure been the same?
Yeah, again, a good question. So yes, there is definitely, a staging that is taking place, and you can see, especially from the, serious faces that, especially in the early pictures, many of them, no one is smiling. Uh, um, Actually, my mother, uh, who died a few years ago, but would be considered one of the older generation people. Whenever we used to take a photograph, she never wanted to smile. So her face was always very severe looking and and she felt that smiling was staged. When you smiled, you were staging it actually. But so that's a different perspective, and so she felt that, she said, why should I stage, my, I mean, why should the photograph be staged? I shall be myself, not realizing that that severe face that she had was actually also could be could be quite staged as well. So yeah, I mean, from all these pictures, I mean, there's a lot of work that has been done upon Africa, in places like Africa, where you know, where what it meant to be photographed, that kind of work exists. And actually, even in, I don't know what it is in your languages, but in Mizo, a photograph is thalak, thalak, which means actually, you take the soul of a person. So taking the image of a person or taking the soul of a person, you take the car of a person. So I think, I mean, that is how people understood it, because a photo, one should, try and understand how alien it must have been. There's a very interesting story about how even the act of writing was something that was so new for many of the people in this region, and they felt it was like magic. It was a magic paper because this Savage and Lorraine, in his, there's a logbook, and he says that they were so surprised that uh, one person wrote something at one end, and the same exact same thing could be said by another person to whom the paper is delivered. You know, I mean, it was a completely, different understanding altogether, wherein how could just a piece of paper and that writing convey the exact same words? So writing itself, I think we have to understand the kind of impact it would have had on society. So photographs also, therefore, was something that was, I think, seen with fear, with awe at the same time. And there is, of course, a certain staging, but the classic staging of a photograph is, this was an essay, I think, that was written by Albin von Stockhausen, if I'm not mistaken, wherein he traces uh, uh, a German photographer who was in the Naga Hills during the Second World War, and who was uh, following Führer Heimendorf wherever he went. And so he took many pictures of uh, of Führer Heimendorf taking pictures. Unfortunately, because it was the Second World War and he was German, he had to leave. And even Führer Havendorf, I think, had to leave, but he was an American citizen. So I'm not sure, I don't really remember. So, but in one of the photographs that he took, this German guy took, I forget his name at the moment, you see that Führer Hammendorf is asking the girl to undress so that she appears topless. So this is like you have this staged Naga woman, topless Naga woman. And the picture that is taken is a very, very well known picture of a topless Naga woman. So the extent of the staging. So I was just saying, in comparison, maybe it's because there were no professional anthropologists who wanted this idea of primitiveness to be shown in a particular way. Maybe that's the reason. But definitely, or maybe, you know, people had more access to, I don't know what the reason was, but definitely in the case of the Lushai Hills, um, uh, many of the colonial officials also mentioned the kind of clothing that people wore and things like that.
Does anybody else have a question? I have many, many questions. I think we should have a conversation together, but anyone?
Very quick question, if we have time.
Yes, Joshua. In fact, I was hoping you'd come in because the last time we had this, the other talk in which you spoke about the lack of written stories. And, for me, it was something that I thought about quite a bit actually after our talk. So I just addressed that to Professor Joy, as you might have heard. But we'd love to hear your questions and thoughts on that as well.
I was actually not going to ask any questions because I recently attended a lecture by Ujoy and where I asked lots of questions. So I was going to observe and listen more. But Ujoy, you mentioned just now about this talak, how actually there are so many ways that language has transformed, or how the Mizo language is used to kind of connotate or suggest like these modern terms, like taking a photo. Like talak is actually like a very spiritual or something that refers to the soul. And from my research currently, I also discovered that like trong trai, which means to pray, was actually like kind of a repurposing of language. Try meaning to like kind of appease the spirits or kwanu. Like I hadn't heard of this either before. Like how do you think like these languages, like I think this also connects back to Veret's question of decolonization, is how do we come to understand like a lot of the terms, a lot of the ways that we function as a society today, like I think namely Christian society today, with these kinds of words, how do we deconstruct language like that? And my second question pertaining to that is, how do you suggest from an academic point of view, from a writer as well, like how do we bring these conversations to the general? Because as an artist, I'm a dancer and performer, so there are all these talks and discourses we're trying to like prevent, like preventing flattening of stereotypes of the Northeast, especially Mizo, and in presenting our works from the region, how to not exoticize ourselves, but you go into the state-funded art galleries, and then you see, like, as you said, these stagings of what it is to be a tribal Mizo identity. And so how do you bridge these kinds of conversations and discourse to the general public? Like, just your thoughts on it, and also how have you seen language kind of transform meaning as we readapt them to describe the modern world that we live in now?
Yeah, okay. Very good question, but very difficult question as well. So, I think we all function from the point of view of thinking that culture is an end. Okay? But actually, culture is something that has emerged out of what people have done or what we do. Okay, so I don't know whether I'm making sense over there, and I wish you had not turned off your thing so that anyway. So yeah, I know
I'm
you're
here
there.
making notes.
Yeah. So no, it's just that when you see a person, then it's easier to talk. So culture is something that we do. It is something. It is not an end in itself. I don't know whether that idea is something that you would agree with. It's not an end in itself. It's something that we do. It's something. Um, See, for instance, nowadays we will say chapchar koot. Now, chapchar koot has nothing to do with it had everything to do with our agrarian cycles, right? But our society is far removed from those agrarian cycles, and so chapchar koot is now staged, okay, and we call it culture, okay. Whereas in the past, that chapchar koot, or this is a festival, the spring, what is known as spring festival, in Mizoram today, it emerged out of something that people were doing. They were burning the jooms, and after the burning of the jooms, they had rest, and therefore they felt that they should have a festival. So it emerged out of that. It was very organic, is what I'm trying to say. So now I think what people are under pressure a lot to do is to stage that culture, right? To stage that culture. But I think culture is culture should be a means through which you are staging what you want to do. So you have to have an objective in mind, and the culture that you have is something that you use in order to be able to lend a voice to something that you want to say. You know, so this is the problem with our society today, because we think of culture as this sort of as a watertight set of things that that we do, but it's dynamic. No culture has remained static. Culture has always changed over the years. It is dynamic. It evolves according to how things are done, and we see this happening. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen very consciously at times. Sometimes it happens very consciously also, but it happens very unconsciously too. It's a very organic way in which things are done. Like, for instance, since Mizos are very Christian, I'll give you an example about how, say, for instance, in Delhi, how the Easter is celebrated, or how Good Friday is celebrated by the Delhi Mizo Fellowship. The way it is done um, is the result of the context that we are in. It is formed by the context that we are in. So it emerges as, and at the end of the day, it will become like, for people who come from Mizoram, they'll say, oh, these Delhi people, the way they do things. So it becomes another way. So basically, what I'm just trying to say here is that I think the culture should be seen as a means to be able to do, to be able to do the things that you visualize, you envision, you think about, and it is formed by the things that you do. I don't know whether that makes sense, but that is my take on it. What was your first question? Something that was very close to what Vered said, which I wanted to. Do you remember?
About languages, how languages has been like readapted to
So
kind of
so
describe different
this is
cultures.
something. this is something that very important to know your history. This is something that the early missionaries, and not just the missionaries, there is a very interesting example about how Shakespeare, J. Shakespeare, who was the superintendent in Aizawl at that point of time in the early 20th century, he called the missionaries from the north and the south. And he said, what is going to be the word for soul? What is going to be the Mizo word? Nowadays we say it as Tharao, or I forget whether it was soul or spirit. But it's taken, it is taken for granted that, soul or Tharao is the word for soul. But then they had to, and whether this Tharao was the exact meaning of the soul that the missionaries wanted to convey. So this J. Shakespeare called a conference, and they asked many people, many Mizos, what do you think is the right way? What does it mean? So people came up with the root of a person, words like bull, Mizo bull, or mishing bull, that is the root of a person. Or so they came up with different words, and then finally they said that, okay, Kharao will be the equivalent of the word for soul. Okay, so it has been, a process of constant, back and forth in words. Like, for instance, Mizo word, use of the word Pathian. Pathian was the, how does, this is a common thing that many missionaries faced. Okay, like I'll give you the example of Japan. When the Portuguese arrived there, how do you translate the word God into Japanese? So now at that point of time, Latin was used. So they said, shall we use the word Deus? Now, if you use the word Deus, for the Japanese, it's an alien concept. They have no way of understanding that you're talking about a God who is supreme, right? So one of the Japanese translators, he said, let's use Danichi, the word Danichi. Okay. So they started using the word Danichi, but when they used the word Danichi, they realized that it was later on, soon afterwards, they realized that it was a word that was used for a bodhisattva. So people were confusing the Christian God with an incarnation of the Buddha, okay, of one of the incarnations of the Buddha. So then they realized that this is not going to work. And then they continued to transliterate the word Deus into a Japanese form. So they started saying Deus se or something like that, which the Japanese could understand, and they used the word Deus. Similarly, in China, there was a lot of controversy about what kind of word to use for the Christian God. The Chinese, through their Confucianism and Taoism and all that stuff, had the word for heaven. So eventually, in Chinese, in Mandarin, the word for God, if you translate it, it means Lord of the Heaven. Lord of the Heaven. That's what it means. So therefore, similarly, even among the Mizos, if they said some other god, it was very difficult. So then they began to use Pathian. So they used Pathian over other words that were there, like Huanu is also there. There are other words. So they use. So what you find is that there is constantly that kind of the missionaries always face this problem of how does one make the message relevant in a way that the people would understand, but also at the same time show distinctiveness. Because if it was the same thing that the locals worshipped, then what's the point? No, it has to be distinctive at one level, but at the same time similar as well. So that's a kind of negotiation that is always happening when the missionaries come in. Well,
Do you have any more follow-ups, Joshua?
No, thank you. Lots of food for thought. I think last comment would be that I've always thought of, like, with the Christian influence, there were a lot of artifacts, like different kinds of instruments banished from the church, all of these things, but actually language seeped in so many ways that kind of penetrated beyond, and it's a lot to examine and think about. So thanks for the talk again today.
yeah, thank you, Joshua.
Thank you, Professor Joy. Just thinking of like history and knowing history, I just had a thought here because I've been visiting everyone and some of the fellows in the Northeast. Met you in Aizawl as well and had the opportunity to listen to you speak there too. And even thinking of Sojanya, Motop, Janice who are here as well, they're all trying to trace their own histories and then use that as a kind of research material to take it forward in their own projects. Something that really struck me during your talk in Aizawl was also about how to look at history, how you look at history in your own practice as like different contingencies rather than, a linear straight line. And something that the fellows, the practitioners have also been doing is also finding this little figments, little moments, because a lot of the history that we know today is a lot through like collective memory, and there are a lot of gaps in that, and a lot of filling in with imagination is happening. So I was just wondering if we could wrap up the talk with you sharing about your own practice a little bit around like writing history. That's
Okay. Yeah, that's a that's sorry. Yeah, I think at one level, how shall I answer this question? I think at one level these days there's a lot of interdisciplinary research that's going on. And while that is very good, and I appreciate that, and I myself am do anthropology and history and all of that together, I think it's very important to be rooted in a particular kind of methodology, you know? So, for instance, in history, the idea of evidence, the idea of sources, what kind of, and how do we use them, how do we interpret them, is a very important methodology, which I think because of the linguistic turn, many people have sort of done away with, you know. So I think as a historian, I am one who strongly advocates the need for sources, the need for evidence in writing things, and not assumptions, and not, what do you think something could have been in the past and things like that. Okay, so that's one thing I think in my methodology that I find very, very important. The second thing about writing history is that um, you have to take the past for itself. Sometimes we look at it from what is known in history as, very presentist concerns. That is like you judge the past from the framework of the present, or you try to look for things in the past that are prevalent in the present. But I think it's very important for a person doing history to understand the past for what it was on its own terms, you know. And this is something that is very often known as historical understanding, historical consciousness. Okay, so and this is something that is, I think, increasingly lacking in many, many young people today. The idea of trying to have an understanding of the past on its own terms. There's what did one the famous quote, history is an alien land. They did things there differently or something of that sort. They did things there differently. So how did they do those things differently? How we have to learn to understand that, I feel. And I think I don't know whether it's the right forum to say this, but post-colonial theory is something that, and post-colonialism is something that we need to think about more seriously, in the sense of critique it more. Critique it more. We very often just accept it for what it is. We think that it is something that rescues us, that saves us from what we were in the past. And so we sort of accept it wholeheartedly. But I think it's something that we need to kind of critique and understand. And not to say that everything that was done during colonialism was good, not to say that everything that the missionaries did was good. That would be wrong. But if you're going to understand the past on its own terms, then you have to think of the past a little differently, rather than seeing them from these kinds of frames that has been imposed on us. So, like for instance, in the past, Marxist with a big M was something that was important, and everybody started trying to see class in everything, even when there was no class. So I think we use that same kind of, we fall into the similar kind of a problem when we try to see everything through a post-colonial sort of framework. So we need to like sort of critique it a little bit more, I think. Okay? That's my particular, and also especially when you look at our sort of micro histories of our particular regions and things like that, we realize, like for instance, that there's a lot of agency negotiation, even though there, and um, dynamic sort of cultural changes, and many a times people are making choices which they think is for their good. And I think sometimes we need to kind of learn to understand the times in which they were operating. So I think we have to be sympathetic a bit to the past. I think that's my yeah, that's my take as a historian. Okay, so I don't know whether that answers your question.
Thank you so much. No, thank you for the lovely presentation as well, and I'm sure like it resonated with a lot of people here today. I think with this we can wrap up the talk. Thank you to everyone who stayed till the very end as well. In case you would like to reach out to Professor Joy, please write to us. I can also share her email ID with you. Bered, I think, and if I missed anybody else. I think that's it. Thank you so much for
Thank
coming.
you. Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, Mary.
Thank
See you
you.
soon.
Bye. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. See you, Ishwari.
See you. Be in touch.